I'm at Chalmette Battlefield, part of Chalmette National Historical Park, just outside of New Orleans. And this place is where the famous Battle of New Orleans happened on January 8, 1815.
The Battle of New Orleans was the last major battle of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 began in June of 1812 when the U.S. Congress declared war on Britain. At that time, the British were preoccupied with fighting Napoleon, so they didn't have very many resources that they could spare for fighting the Americans. Apart from blockading American ports, the British spent the first 2 years of the war mostly just defending against American attacks on Canada. Then, in 1814, the British and their allies defeated Napoleon and sent him into exile on the Mediterranean island of Elba. With Napoleon out of the way, for now, the British could devote more resources to the fight with the Americans. In 1814, the British launched an invasion of the Chesapeake. They captured Washington, D.C. and torched the White House and the Capitol building. But the American defenders turned the British back at Baltimore. After failing to take the Chesapeake, the British turned to attack New Orleans, to take the strategic port city and prevent the Americans from having access to the mouth of the Mississippi River.
And so they came here and they failed terribly. So this battle took place on January 8, 1815. And the British were trying to march across this field here behind me. The British were coming from the opposite direction, where that smokestack is, marching across the field, and there were American forces here in the foreground who were trying to prevent the British from coming through here and reaching New Orleans.
The British attackers were led by General Edward Pakenham, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars and brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington. On the other side, the American troops were led by General Andrew Jackson, a Southern planter and future President of the United States. The American lines were protected by fortifications, including breastworks and a canal called the Rodriguez Canal. To gain control of the field, the British would have to cross over the canal. They did cross the canal in a couple of places, but they weren't able to break through the American lines because the American defenses were too strong.
So the British did not manage to break through, and eventually they retreated. They experienced very, very heavy losses in the Battle of New Orleans, and it was incredibly lopsided. There were more British than there were Americans here, but far more British were lost than Americans in this battle. So the British lost about 2,000 people. That is both killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. The Americans lost about 20. That's killed and wounded. So it's about 100 to 1 casualty rates or loss rates for this battle. So very humiliating defeat for the British, a very sensational victory for the Americans. This is the American side of the lines. Behind me is the rampart that Jackson's troops built to prevent the British from entering New Orleans. And just behind the rampart is the Rodriguez Canal. So there was the canal and then the rampart to defend the American lines. This section of the lines didn't have the British come directly at it, but there were artillery, like this cannon behind me, and there were lots of men with guns to shoot at the British, and so they inflicted a lot of the casualties. Many of the highly uneven casualties came from, were inflicted by guns on this side. And the British marched from this direction across the battlefield toward the monument, which commemorates the battle, commemorates the British defeat, the American victory. And right where I'm standing is one of the artillery batteries that the British set up to fire at the American line. Here on the north side of the battlefield is where the British made their main assault against the American lines. They were unable to break through the American lines except in a few places. And Major General Pakenham, the British commanding officer, rode his horse forward to try to rally his troops, and it was about at this point that he was killed.
General Pakenham was 36 years old when he was killed. After the battle, his body was taken back to Ireland and buried in his family tomb. The bodies of most of the other British dead stayed in Louisiana, and nobody knows for sure where they were buried.
The American victory at the Battle of New Orleans is important for a number of reasons. One reason was that it was a decisive American victory at the end of the War of 1812. Now, the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed by American and British negotiators in Belgium, but the treaty hadn't been ratified by the U.S. government yet. It hadn't even made its way across the Atlantic. So the war was still going on, even though it should have ended by this point.
The Battle of New Orleans was also a major cultural moment for Americans in the early 19th century. The fact that the Americans had soundly defeated a numerically superior British force was a source of great national pride. For decades afterward, January 8, the anniversary of the battle, was celebrated as a national holiday, much like the 4th of July is today. The Battle of New Orleans was also significant for American history because it turned General Andrew Jackson into a national hero. It vaulted him onto the national stage and made him into an American celebrity. Jackson used that celebrity to become president, 14 years after the battle. Nowadays, 200 years later, Jackson is pretty controversial, and rightfully so. But there's no doubt that he was one of the most significant American presidents in the 19th century. Had things gone differently in the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson may never have become president, and 19th century America might have looked quite different than it ultimately did.
Thanks for watching my video. This is Willie Logan in New Orleans, Louisiana, signing off.